Hey everybody, welcome back to Gearhead Daily. I'm Eric, and hopefully every single day I like to bring you something that is interesting or fun in the automotive world. Sometimes not so fun, a little bit enraging. And I'm doing some testing with my microphone because for some things that I'm doing with it externally, I need to practice with a little bit. So I'm just doing some practice here. But today I wanted to bring you something about the mid-engine Corvette that could have been. And Hemmings Daily today has produced some history behind it about a car that could have been the mid-engine Corvette powered by a Wankel motor. So here's the interesting thing, and here's the opening caption that they have here with the photo, and it looks very kind of reminiscent of the Lamborghini Moira that I think was really good back in the day. Here's a quick photo of the Miura that I was referring to. It's reminiscent. It's not the same thing, obviously, but it's kind of got the same shape. Very elegant looking car. So that could have been in 1973 the concept. So let's kind of go on and figure out some of the history that goes with it. This was going to be built atop a shortened 914 chassis, which, it seems to be a very popular thing nowadays for guys to grab a Porsche 914 or some kind of other variant and then drop an LS motor in it, making what probably should have been the amount of horsepower that car should have made. But they are just boatloads of fun, and you can find examples out there for $10,000 to $15,000 that are fairly decent. But a 914 that has been small block swapped already. So it was supposed to be a Porsche 914 chassis with a steel body. Most Corvettes are fiberglass even back then, so this was a little bit interesting, but it was going to be crafted by Pininfarina. Okay, so again, back to that Miura concept. It was going to have a two-rotor engine with it was going to be the Corvette XP X97 GT, and could have been the future that was. And honestly, I think they should have made that. It would have been awesome. And can you imagine what Corvette life would be right now if we had that mid-engine concept way back in the 70s? It never would have been the same. So this was rescued by from a crusher. Oh, yeah. So a lot of the concept cars either get immediately crushed or put in some museum because they can never be road driven. They can never be titled because they're considered concept vehicles. So this one made a appearance in the 2019 Amelia Island Corsa Elegance. Very cool. Very well done restoration, looks like, from the outside. And according to the article, in the early 70s, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and AMC all looked at the Wankel rotary engine of the future. Now, a little bit of history about the Wankel engine. Here it is. And the concept of it, if you're not familiar, looks like this. You basically have a triangle rotor, and you either get one or two kind of halves to it, depending on how many rotors you kind of want to shove in there. The design of it actually, even though it kind of wobbles around inside there, creates a fairly smooth motor. The issue is nobody has really come up with a really good way of keeping these things together for a really long period of time. And Mazda eventually, most people know them for the RX-7. However, if we go back into the history of the Wankel engine, it was actually back in the 50s when it was starting developing. So the issue, though, is that the manufacturers did not find a really good way to be able to keep these going for a really long period of time. And they made power, and they made decent power for a very small, compact, kind of engine. However, they didn't make power until way up in the power range, 6,000 to 7,000 RPM. And before that, they were just kind of dogs. So, and the other issue, as a friend of mine pointed out very easily, is between the two halves. If you've got a two-rotor motor, what happens is you've got a half, and if you don't properly warm it up every single time, that seal between those two halves tends to kind of get messed up, and you've got engine failure pretty easily. So a friend of mine was a Mazda technician for a while, and I showed up, and there's 4 or 5 crate engines sitting there, and I said, "What's going on?" And he says, "I can't tell you how many motor replacements I've had to do, because here in Minnesota, pretty standard, people would you got to move your car. So you would start it up, you would move it 15 feet, whatever it is, so somebody else can move or get out. And then suddenly you stop it, and that was enough to create disturbance between the seal. And so they were doing motor replacements under warranty left and right. And he said doing several a week for months at a time. So the design itself is a good design. However, nobody has yet quite figured out how to make it last. That's the issue. But yeah, if you're not familiar, in 1951, it was developed in Germany by Felix Wankel. Okay, licenses were issued in the 60s, as a lot of manufacturers here, right? You can see all the manufacturers: Alfa Romeo, AMC, Citroën, Ford, GM, everybody, Mazda. Lots of people have owned this patent and this design for some use in something, including motorcycles and helicopters, for a very long time. So a lot of companies have borrowed this design. Again, nobody has quite figured out how to make it run and stay together properly for a significant period of time. So, it was developed here. We've got some, Mazda obviously taking the lead with that RX-7. It's the most popular version everybody knows. The RX-8 was also part of there too. AMC at one point was so convinced that the Rotary would play an important role in power plant for cars of the future. Okay, so here's the fun part about that. Neither of those two things are present today. The Wankel engine died in 2012. Okay, so here is a wonderful graphic of how it works. You've got intake and exhaust, and you kind of got this little triangular thing kind of bouncing around like so. And you've got your compression and your ignition and your exhaust cycle, very much like your standard engine. However, you only have kind of one rotating piston, less moving parts, the better, right? So, in theory, it was a pretty decent, it's a pretty decent design. However, for whatever reason, most companies couldn't figure it out. Now, in the 70s, when you're making yourself a concept car, you want kind of the latest and greatest and something kind of unique and out there. So you've got a Porsche chassis with a steel body with a German engine in the back. Okay, so it's in the back. It's not even in the front. You don't even have the standard design. So this at the time would have been revolutionary as far as Corvette models were concerned. This would have taken it in an entirely new direction. And they probably, if it were up to me, which of course it's not, probably should have given it a different name to distinguish it from the Corvette line, because I think at the time the Corvette was kind of well established as front engine, rear wheel drive. But you never know. So again, in the 70s, all looked at the Wankel engine. It was smaller, lighter, and had pretty decent power for what it was. So they embraced, among the U.S. companies, they embraced the future. Okay, like the Vega and other the Vega. Whew. Speaking of cars that aren't around anymore, and for good reason too. And economy cars all the way up to performance cars. If somebody can figure out the Wankel, good on them. But if you notice, look at this fan design here. I actually believe that's a stock part off of a G. I think that's like a truck fan. That's not a. I think that's one right off the line. So anyway, credit or blame depending on one's perspective. The complete book of the Corvette, every model since '53, cites a 1980 Auto Week interview with Zora Duntov. Ed Cole was enamored with the Wankel engine, and he kept twisting my arm. What about a rotary Corvette? Again, that would have been quite the departure for folks. The RC was under development for use in the next generation Vega, which was slated to get a two-rotor engine, so 266 cubic inch, and rated 180 horsepower. So for the 70s, that would have been fairly decent, and usually the Wankel motors get relatively good mileage, so not a huge deal. However, the reason they died in 2012 from Mazda is because Mazda could not figure out how to get them to pass emissions. So that's kind of the other big deal. But again, the Wankel engine's small, as you can tell from this photo here, way smaller than even the LS motors today. Even a four-cylinder Still get pretty decent power. Throw a turbo on one of these things, and they're pretty cool little motors, little plucky things. So, to increase the car's appeal in global markets, the decision was made to downsize the Corvette, which would have saved weight and increased performance. Again, go to fiberglass, get rid of the steel body, but again, they didn't ask me. Without a suitable platform in-house, they'd have to go to Europe, so for that 914 chassis. But it still wasn't small enough. They had to cut 6 inches off it. And if you've ever driven a 914 is relatively, stout, or small wheelbase little car. So not sure where Corvette was going with this, but again, designed to be by Pininfarina, so it was going to be good. It was going to be an attractive car, and again, very reminiscent of that Lamborghini Mira. God, Mira. I think it's Mira. And let's go with Mira. Let's go with that. So, shortly after the rotary-powered engine appeared on the show circuit. So, if you were around in '73, you could have seen this. That would have been cool. Made their rounds at car shows across the globe through the summer of '74, and then they pulled the plug with the rotary engine, citing difficulties in getting it emissions certified. Sound familiar? More stringent emissions, especially in the '70s, were choking everything, by the way. That's why the big block went away. The American cars kind of had this arrogance of, if they're going to do more emission stuff on us, you know what, we're just going to throttle the crap out of our small block engines and make them anemic, rather than coming up with something new or more efficient like the Japanese were doing. They decided, nope, we're going to stick with that small block because that's what we've got, and we've already ordered 600 billion of them. What are we going to do? Remelt them? So who knows? Even if the rotary engine could pass more stringent federal requirements, making them less thirsty posed an entirely new set of challenges. So yeah, the oil crisis as well kind of killed that. And also getting it back to the United States posed an issue. They had to pay a duty to import the car from Pininfarina, so it was temporary for display only. Avoiding paying additional taxes, GM pulled the RCE and transmission, created up the concept, and stored it at Vauxhall in England. Okay. For those of you not familiar, GM owns Vauxhall as well. So it was largely forgotten until somebody remodeling the facility brought it back to light. So awesome them. Good job. So they received a tip. The car was bound for destruction. So good on you for saving. This is totally awesome. Great story. They phoned the head of GM. Again, this is not a production car. This is not something that you can just take and do. So we had to get permission. Chuck Jordan obtaining permission to purchase the vehicle. They got an agreement. So they saved it from the scrapyard, which I think is a cool little piece of history that they did. To put the car back into the road, he temporarily installed a 4-cylinder engine, from a Cavalier, a Vauxhall Cavalier, and replaced it with a Mazda 13B rotary. Okay, so keep it more traditional with it, but I don't think they'd able to. You'd be darn near impossible to find the original motor that went for it. So that might have been the end of the story, except he was persistent. When GM abandoned the development of the program, it looked at to put much of the distance as possible between itself and that rotary engine concept. Probably a good idea. A lot of companies realized the constraints of the rotary engine. So they were scrapped. One notable remained. So I'm glad they were able to keep that. This is totally cool. So I don't know. What do you think? Should should this have been the Corvette way back in the day? I think it's a pretty attractive looking car, especially for the 70s. 70s was a rough time for automotive design. So I don't know. What do you think? I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out. Otherwise, this has been your kind of daily dose of Gearhead. See ya.